Welcome to FOB TV, the future of business. I'm your host, Kevin Benedict. I'm a futurist here at TCS, and I want to thank all of you guys for joining the show today. I'm so excited to have as our guest Ted Shelton, who's the Chief Operating Officer for Inflection AI. Thanks for joining us today, Ted.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Where are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from my office in Palo Alto, California.
I kind of recognize the trees and park-like setting from that area. I've been able to spend over my career a lot of time at, I think, 3 different areas. VMware and SAP and HP are all places that I've frequented throughout my career. So it kind of looks like that from all the trees I see in your background.
Yep, definitely all 3 of them right up the road from us.
Now, has California always been kind of hometown for you, or is this a new thing?
No, I grew up here and did spend a lot of time out of California. I went to the University of Chicago and also spent time working in London and Paris, New York. But raised my kids here and called California home.
So I first became acquainted with you probably over a decade ago when we were both working at the same company at that time, Cognizant, and you were in charge of the digital part of Cognizant. And I always heard your reputation preceded you because everybody talked very highly of you. And so that was an interesting time in both of our careers to be on the same company.
Very, very kind of you, and also kind of you to give me a promotion. I definitely was not in charge. I think Malcolm Frank was in charge first, and then Gajen took over. But yeah, it was super exciting period of my career. Yes.
Oh yeah, that was fun. Now I keep up with you because I read your blog regularly, and I have some questions on that. Actually, you seem so. I blog a lot too, but I'm not as well organized as you. When I read your blogs, they look like you have like a 6-month outline with chapters already predetermined, and then you just send them out so pre-planned and well organized. Talk to us about your habit there. Is this like the beginning of a book? Is that why it's so organized? Or tell us your practice around blogging.
Yeah, no, happy to do that. I really struggle with the format of a book because I feel like in this information category that the world is changing so rapidly that as soon as you manage to get a book out the door, it's probably irrelevant. Now, there are exceptions to that. I think I recently finished reading Fei Li's book, The Worlds I See. And her book is a lot about the history. It's an autobiography. It talks about herself as well as the history of how artificial intelligence developed. So that's stuff that doesn't change. That's a great book. But the stuff I'm writing about is constantly changing. And so that's actually why I chose the medium of a LinkedIn newsletter. Now, I do structure the LinkedIn newsletter so that I think about 3 categories. Like there is a historical element. I want to talk about how we got to the point we are today, who the people were, what the inventions were. And then I want to talk about things that are happening right now. So I might talk about a product that's been released or a new innovation that's just come out or a company that's doing something interesting. And then I want to talk about the issues that we're looking forward and sort of evoke more of a philosophical conversation about what the future is and what we should be thinking about and struggling with individually and as organizations. So there is that structure to it. But actually, I'll be honest, I don't necessarily know what I'm going to write about until I'm struck by something. So I, for example, saw Hume AI come out. And for me, being really interested in emotional intelligence, which we'll talk about Inflection later, I'm sure, is really exciting to see another company out there addressing some of the same questions that Inflection is. And so I immediately jumped on it, tried it out, had a bunch of impressions, and wrote about it. So it really can be that quick, or sometimes I'll be mulling something over in my head for a week. And my writing approach, going back to the methodology question, is I really write everything ahead of time in my head. And so it'll be while I'm on the bicycle or running or in the shower. And then it's when it all has coalesced and come together that I sit down at the keyboard and it just all comes out in a rush and I write it one sitting. And I try to do it at least once a week, but it doesn't necessarily always happen.
Understood. Well, thank you so much for pulling back the curtains and showing us your writing process. That's awesome. On my phone, I always, in the notes section on my iPhone, I have article ideas and I have these long series of ideas that I'm always writing down because just like you do, you get inspired in all the kind of interesting different situations. You have to capture that, at least if you're like me, because if I don't capture that, I will forget it by tomorrow. I was like this is the greatest topic ever. If only I could remember what that was from yesterday. Hey, so you've had the good fortune throughout your career to have leadership positions in all kinds of really cool companies from Bain and Catalytic and Genpact and Cognizant. What attracted you to Inflection AI?
Yeah. Well, I think the most important reason is the amazing thing that Inflection has created. If your listeners haven't tried out Pi, you can go to pi.ai or you can download it from the Apple App Store or Google Play. And it is a very different experience of interacting with an AI. So people have, and maybe you have also used ChatGPT. And ChatGPT, the design of it is very much around how do I give you an answer? So you ask something, and you can see that they're thinking about the implications of AI in search or Bing, right, where it's also applied, right? You say, hey, clearly that's completely integrated with search. And the objective in the design of Inflection was actually to create a conversational partner and one that was really a personal assistant, a personal aid to help you think through things. So, I mean, one of the stories that I just love is so many people have told me that they turn Pi on in the car. Because you can also, by the way, talk to it. It has a voice interface. We're one of the first to do that. If they're driving somewhere and they're alone, normally if you had a person in the car, you would talk to them. Well, you can talk to Pi, and people will tell me that they're thinking through something at work or something in a relationship or whatever, and that Pi becomes this interlocutor to think it through. And so that got me really excited about the potential. Because I think that innovation around the human-computer interface is one of the things that we really have to get right as AI continues to be an important part of how we work, how we live, and how we're going to coexist. As Ethan Mollick says, the co-intelligence that we're going to have available in our lives. We have to be able to interact with it. So that's really what got me excited.
No, that's fantastic. So some of our listeners have likely not kept up with all the rapid changes around the AI and generative AI space because a lot happens almost on a weekly basis.
Daily even.
Yeah. So for those that don't follow the day-to-day developments of AI companies, why don't you share us a little bit of the background from the inception of Inflection AI and how it's different from some of the other ones and, where are you guys going in the market today?
Sure. Well, our founders were Reid Hoffman, of LinkedIn fame, and Mustafa Suleyman of.
I have his book right here, The Next Wave.
Coming Wave, yeah.
Yeah, The Coming Wave.
So Mustafa, of course, founded DeepMind in 2010 in London, and it was bought by Google, became Google DeepMind. He left Google in 2022 in January 2022, co-founded Inflection with Reid. And the objective, he coming out of the Google research labs, he knew how to create a large language model that was good at answering questions, like the OpenAI team. His question was, how do I actually create a better human-computer interface? How do I create an AI that is compassionate, engaged, supportive? And Mustafa has an amazing background. And when you read his book, one of the things you'll learn is when he was a young man, he helped start a hotline in the UK, in London, for Muslim youth, and then worked for the mayor of London around equity and mental health programs. So he has had a very long commitment to human behavior and improving conditions for humans. So taking that to technology was a natural step for him. And that's why I think the Inflection LLM is so different from some of the other models. It's every bit as good as the top models. So if you think about what the top models are that are out there, Gemini, Anthropic, OpenAI's GPT, but Inflection is, scores right there in the top percentage with all of those models, but it has this very different interface. And so when we talk to people about their experiences with it, people really are passionate about using this model in a way that I don't hear about the other models. You should try it. You should give it a try.
Yeah,
And see what you
absolutely.
think as well.
So talk to us about some of the changes that you guys are going through.
Well, we've decided to really focus on the enterprise, and so that's part of what attracted me. Going back to that question, I've worked in the enterprise my entire professional career, and what I see is enterprises need this kind of high EQ and high IQ LLM. Now, the other thing that's really exciting about this is it's not just the LLM. So sure, I can download Llama or other models, but all of these advanced platforms, whether it's Gemini or Anthropic or GPT or ours, it's actually a compound AI application with a whole set of components and multiple models, a mixture of experts that are designed to be able to serve a certain kind of purpose. Now, the Pi example that's out there in the consumer space is tuned to solving consumer sort of interaction. What we're doing is actually tuning it now for a business interaction. And so what we'd like people to think about this is from the perspective of having a coworker. So today you might use ChatGPT, and I think the sort of common rhetoric around it is, it's a smart but fallible intern. And so you can give it direction, but you have to closely monitor its output. Well, I'm not saying you can't treat this like an intern too, but where our aspiration is to actually get it to the point where it's a trusted coworker that you're saying, still you're having as a human being to go and look at the work like you would with a coworker though, and say, is this right or not? But we're trying to build specialized expertise around particular topics. So that when you're using it for a particular business purpose, hey, it's actually been trained on knowledge for that particular purpose.
Oh, that's fascinating. So, can you give us kind of an overview of the industry around generative AI right now? It seems like it's difficult to stay up on the rapid pace of all the changes. So, what's your take on where the industry is right now?
Well, I think the bifurcation of the industry right now is on the one hand in the hyperscalers, right? So you've got Google GCP, Amazon AWS, and Microsoft Azure, each offering access to a set of models. And there's basically two other large models out there, Anthropic and OpenAI. And the majority of the way that then people are accessing machine intelligence is through a web page, a mobile app, or an API. But it's all hosted in the hyperscalers. The bifurcation comes with the open source community. And so the sort of second way of doing it, and Hugging Face now has over 50,000 open source models. There's a couple of leading ones, Llama, of course, from Meta, Mistral, Falcon from the Middle East. And so you've got this set of models where you can download the model, run it yourself, have complete control over how it runs, how you configure it. But it is just a model, right? Whereas those ones that are hosted in the hyperscalers are a complete application framework for an AI application. So there's a lot more work to get value out of those open source models. And the open source models are relatively small and less functional than the larger models. So the interesting thing that we asked ourselves was, is there another path? Is there a third way of doing this? And what our belief is that there are many enterprises that do want to own their own AI, but they need the whole AI application framework. They don't just need a model, and they'd like to have a company behind it supporting it, and they would like it to be as functional as those large models. And there are three primary reasons that we hear companies frequently saying for that. Number one is they have a large quantity of internal information, and it's impractical to use that information with these large hosted models. Number two is amongst that information, there's a lot of very sensitive and confidential information. And so they're concerned, even with the reassurances they're being given by the hyperscalers, they're concerned about where that information might go. And so they want to keep it within their own trust boundary within their organization. And number three, they're worried about cost. I just talked to a large retailer yesterday who said, we have our first operational Gen AI application up and running. And it's really exciting, except for the fact that it's already generating $200,000 to $300,000 worth of API expenses every month. Okay, yeah, this is starting to get really pricey to use generative AI. For all those reasons, we think there's this interesting middle road where open source is attractive because companies can own it themselves. Own your own intelligence is the language I think that's beginning to emerge in the industry. We want to help companies own their own intelligence, but at the next level up, right? At that more complex, more capable model and compound AI application architecture.
So let's talk about the ERPs out there, the giants out there. How do you envision they will actually use it? Is it for customer facing? Is it for the users in HR and everywhere else? Or do you think it's going to be ubiquitous intelligence across every aspect of the business?
Yeah, I guess the answer to your question is in what time scale? And I think there's an early indication that there are a set of really effective ways to use it to unlock trapped value in organizations in the near term. That doesn't mean we get to ubiquitous anytime soon, right? And it'll depend on company and industry how long it takes, but it could be a decade before it's really truly ubiquitous. I do believe it becomes ubiquitous as the machine intelligence gets better and better. It'll be able to take on more and more ad hoc activities. And my guidance to organizations thinking about this transformation is that there should be three pillars always in the way in which they think about applying AI, which is number one, people should always be responsible for decisions. You cannot hold an algorithm responsible for a decision. You can't put an algorithm in jail. You can't fire an algorithm. You need people to actually take responsibility. And the level of understanding and oversight that a person has should be commensurate with the level of risk around that decision or the consequences of the decision. So if I have a very high consequence decision, then a person should take a lot more interest in making sure they understand how the decision is being made. So that's number one. Number two is people should always direct the machine intelligence. So we shouldn't have machine intelligence off setting its own objectives, and turning the universe into paper clips, as Neil Busser would, allege as a concern. We should make sure we design and deploy systems in such a way that people are always directing them, and directing them has all sorts of implications. In a creative dimension, it means like, well, what kind of creative endeavor do I want to engage in? In a research direction, which cancer am I trying to go and solve? And so you have lots of different notions about what direction means, but that's the second one. And then the third one is the interpersonal relations. And so even though we think Inflection is a terrific, supportive, collaborative AI, it's never going to be able to talk to you about, hey, how did your kids do in the baseball game? My kids did great. How did your kids do? Right? I mean, it's a very different thing, right? And it's the basis of human society, to me, is about these kinds of interactions. It's about developing a relationship with each other and building that relationship also over a long duration. And machines are not going to be that for us. We should not, like in Her, fall in love with the machine.
Right. So tell me about the maturity right now of generative AI. If you look at it, do you see it as being an infant, a toddler, a teenager? Where do you see it on the scale? How much do we have to wait for all the power of generative AI to be brought forward?
Well, I think that the analogy is powerful to human development because it gives us a way of sort of calibrating how we think about the technology. But I think it's a mistake because I think it is a technology. It is a tool. And so the question is, how do you implement and manage the tool? And I can't say that about a human. I can say, how do I manage and deploy or implement the infant or the teenager, right? Those are that organic development process can certainly be influenced by education, coaching, good parenting or bad parenting, right? But in a machine sense, what I see is frequently the people who have the most concerns about using the technology in its current form do not take the time to properly implement the technology. An example of a best practice, the generation of content should always be matched with an evaluation of content. So if I'm building an application in the enterprise that I want, let's say it's I'm generating a report. I can generate the report, but I should have another process that also goes through that report and fact checks it. And that's all before it gets to a human, but it should still get to a human, going back to my point about humans need to still be responsible.
Right.
And so when you do that set of things, rather than just hope that ChatGPT gives you the right answer off the bat, when you do that set of things, you can actually use it in a very effective way. It will take so much time out of the process, but still leave the human in control, and have a much higher chance of being accurate or requiring only minor edits, that you've entirely changed the course of that particular part of the process.
Wow. So let's talk about where AI is today and what is the next phase of AI? Because if you're like myself and many of the people that I work with on a day-to-day basis, we're blown away by the power of generative AI today. Yeah. What should we expect in the next, 2, 3, 4 years?
Yeah. Well, I love Ethan Mollick's comment. And by the way, I mentioned him earlier. If you don't follow Ethan Mollick on LinkedIn or read his blog, One Useful Thing, start doing it right now. He's amazing. He's a professor at Wharton, and who looks at these issues. And one of his sort of throwaway comments is the AI you're using today is the worst AI you'll ever use.
Yeah.
And so I do believe and agree with him that it is going to continue to improve. And I think that there are a lot of questions, though, from an R&D perspective about what that means and what the pace is. So there's a set of people that think we're going to arrive at a artificial general intelligence by the end of the decade. There are other people who think we're going to get to super intelligence, maybe then or shortly thereafter. I think it depends in part about how we decide to build and implement it, but in part about the science. And so there's another set of folks like Jan LeCun at Meta who say, hey, you know what, the transformer model that a lot of what we are amazed by today is based on, it's sort of run its course. So if you think of innovation as a series of S-curves, I think the question to ask is, are we in the middle of the S-curve and there's still a lot of improvement, or are we at the top of the S-curve and we need to look for the next model? So there are other options out there that are challengers to the transformer model. There's a really interesting project out of MIT called Liquid. There's another research group that's working on something called Mamba. So I'm not going to try to explain these, and you can go look them up. But the point is, the pace of innovation is not going to slow down. The question that we don't know the answer to is, where will that innovation take us? But what I do think that we can expect is that there's a set of cognitive tasks that historically we have valued humans doing that actually are really just rote repetitive applications of pattern matching and repeated learned activity. And those are the kinds of things machines are going to do really well. And that's why I have my 3 pillars of things that I really think as human beings, we need to individually focus on in our own development, and as organizations emphasize in our design of systems, because those are the things we're going to do. And AI is going to be amazing at doing everything else.
Wow. So when you talk to business people running a large multinational company, what advice do you give them that will allow them to skate to the puck? Because this is moving so very quickly. And I bet you get the same question over and over. Where do I start? What are the foundational things that my organization needs to fix before we can really bring this heavy, heavy layer of intelligence over our entire organization? So what are those steps that you're advising companies on?
Yep. Well, a couple of things. I think, first of all, you've got to start using the technology, because you will not understand what its promise or peril is unless you're actually engaged in learning about it and using it. So that's number one. Number two is, I think that we're at a stage right now where the main focus for an enterprise should be on looking for that very disruptive, large value opportunity. And every organization has that. It's different for different companies and in different industries. But where you look for, if I could take 98% of the time and labor out of something, because that thing is actually generating value, not just because I'm reducing cost, then where is that activity that I should focus on? So one that I've talked about in the past, and as you know, before coming to this role, I was at Bain & Company, the global management consulting firm. We did a ton of projects, most of which our customers do not want us to talk about.
Yes.
But I was given permission to talk about this one, which is in the pharmaceutical space. And so you can imagine when you're going through the clinical trial process of testing a drug, tens of thousands of pages of documents are created about what's happening during that clinical trial. And when you're complete with the clinical trial and you believe your drug is effective and you have an explanation for why, the regulatory agencies will require that you file an explanation of why do you think the drug is going to actually work for whatever the disease state is. And so you have to summarize those tens of thousands of pages of documents, which takes months of work by very highly trained medical professionals. What if I could actually take those tens of thousands of pages of documents and in minutes summarize them?
Wow.
And so that dramatically changes the length of time it takes to get a drug to market. So forget about the fact that I saved all that money from not having the medically trained professionals work for months on doing the summary. Let's talk instead about the opportunity, the upside opportunity of saving people's lives because they're getting the drug when they otherwise might not have gotten it in time. And also, of course, earning money for the pharmaceutical company months earlier. Those are the enormous opportunities I think that companies need to be looking for and proving the technology first. Then we can worry later about how do we make it ubiquitous, but let's look for the what you might call oil gushers, right? Hey, there's a ton of oil coming out of the ground. How do we cap it?
Yes. So with all the power of AI and the rapid pace of innovation in it, where do you think this will get us in the next 3 to 5 years? And what is missing? I'll do that as a follow-up question because I know that some people say, look, it still gives us hallucinations, so we can't be serious about using it. But there's ways of fixing those hallucinations. And I've read about a lot of them, the ability to have a fact check or to compare it and contrast it with other dependable data sources and things like that. So you're not just throwing hallucinations out to the public. You can actually go through a series of fact checks so that the percentage of accuracy goes way up. So what do you think is missing and what do you think it's going to look like in 5 years?
Yeah. So I think reasonably many organizations feel like the promise of the technology is unproven. And as you say, there are risk factors, hallucination being one shorthand way of framing one of the shortcomings.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there are other organizations that are driving ahead with innovation and finding ways to solve these problems, such as what I described before about every generator prompt should have a evaluator prompt, and every combination of generator and evaluator should have a human checkpoint, right? So there are ways of implementing these systems that still create enormous value, but remove the risk. And so I think what you're seeing in 2024 is a patchwork of, as William Gibson once said, the future is already here. It's just unevenly
distributed.
Yeah. And so you've got companies that are just plowing ahead and creating enormous value, and other companies that are sitting still and going, yeah, I don't know if it's here yet. And what's going to happen is, those companies that are plowing ahead are suddenly going to have outsized performance from their peer group. And their peers are going to ask, wait, I'm the same company that they are. How are they doing so much better? And then they're going to find out that the answer is because they leaned in and were early adopters of innovation around AI in transforming their core business processes. And then those companies that are sitting still right now are going to be in a mad rush to catch up. So I think 2025 and into 2026, I think we'll suddenly see this industry by industry. We'll start seeing these waves of people saying, hey, this isn't a nice to have R&D project. This is a must have if I'm going to stay in business project.
Yes.
So if you think about it as sort of a typical bell curve of adoption, right? You've got those early adopters, Jeffrey Moore this for you, right?
Yeah.
You've got those early adopters that are out there. I think I'm seeing them show enormous positive results. So you're going to leap the chasm and go into that early adopter phase where people still in those early adopter phase will get an enormous amount of value until you get to the middle majority where they're like, hey, we have to do this or we're not going to be in business because it becomes a competitive requirement. And then you'll get the tail of people that are going to go out of business because they didn't get it.
Wow. So when you sit down with an executive of a large company now, where do you tell them to look for the value right now? Is it completely different, or are there like nuggets that are pretty common throughout large enterprises where they could go find value early?
Well, I think there are some nuggets that are pretty common, but I do think that the oil gushers are very specific to companies and industries. Now, I wrote about an example of this in my LinkedIn newsletter recently. Mm-hmm. I had the opportunity, actually, when I was at Cognizant, to go and work with a very large global retailer. And one of the things that shocked me is walking into their corporate headquarters, there was a row of office spaces on either side of the corridor, in which in every single office, there was an employee of that retailer with a vendor wanting to have that retailer carry their goods, pitching their goods. And then later on, I was at the bar at the local hotel where we were staying, and I happened to sit next to one such vendor who told me his whole sorry tale about how he loaded up his car with all his samples and had to drive up from wherever he had driven up from, and in order to have this like half-hour meeting with a buyer, right? And it's a terrible process, right? It's terrible for the vendors. It's terrible for the buyers. There's only a limited number of these kinds of meetings that you can have in any given day, week, year. And so you're also, as a retailer, not getting the best products, right? You're getting some random sample of things that manage to filter through that process. Why not put AI in the middle of that? Why not have AI be the interviewer? So that guy didn't even need to get in his car and drive anywhere. He could go online, have a Zoom meeting like this, have a whole interaction with an AI that would do a first pass evaluation. And so suddenly you're screening 100 or 1,000 times more vendors and using AI as a filter to say, oh, well, these ones we should actually put in front of a buyer, right?
Yeah, and they know second by second customer demand too. So they could, the AI system could look at that and go, you know what? This is a hot category, so I'm going to show more interest to companies coming in with that kind of product.
Or can save all of that information so that when it becomes a hot category in 2 months, it goes, hey, wait, I think I had like 15 vendors that pitched me on that 2 months ago. Let's go bring them back in, right? So that's an oil gusher for a retailer. But I think every industry has a different oil gusher.
Absolutely. Ted, I want to thank you so much for joining us today in your hectic, busy schedule. So thanks for squeezing us in, and we appreciate it.
My pleasure. Great to be here.